The rain had no mercy that evening. It came down in sheets across Gangnam, the kind of cold soul rain that soaked through a jacket before you had time to curse about it. The kind that turned the neon reflections on the pavement into bleeding rivers of red and gold. Adaeze Okafor had been running for 4 minutes straight, her backpack bouncing against her spine, her white hoodie already translucent at the shoulders, her braids stuffed up under a black cap that was doing absolutely nothing to keep her dry. She was late. Not fashionably late. Not even the kind of late you could explain away with traffic. She was criminology midterm notes due tomorrow and she hadn't eaten since 11 a.m. late. And the only thing standing between her and a complete breakdown was the promise of an empty seat and a hot bowl of ramyeon. She pushed through the glass doors of Jongsik, and the warmth hit her like a wall. The restaurant was something out of a magazine. High ceilings with pendant lighting that cast everything in amber. Dark wood panels and white linen tablecloths. Waitstaff in pressed black uniforms moving between tables with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that this place charged 40,000 won for a starter and you did not rush. Adaeze stood at the entrance dripping onto polished marble, her sneakers squeaking, every head within 10 meters turning toward her with the particular expression Koreans reserved for people who had clearly arrived at the wrong coordinates. She didn't care. She scanned the room. Every table was occupied. Businessmen in suits. Couples leaning into candlelight. A table of women laughing behind their hands. Not a single empty chair. Except one. In the far corner, slightly elevated, separated from the main floor by 2 shallow steps and a velvet rope that had been pulled to one side. Probably by a waiter who'd gone to fetch something. There was a table set for 2. White roses in a crystal vase. A single candle. 2 menus placed at opposing seats. Adaeze read the room for exactly 3 seconds, then walked toward it. She unzipped her backpack before she even sat down. By the time she pulled the velvet chair out and settled into it, she already had her annotated copy of Organized Crime Structures in East Asia open on the table beside the white rose arrangement, a highlighter uncapped, and her half-finished notes from Professor Kwan's lecture spread across the linen like she was setting up a study station in the university library. She flagged down a passing waiter without looking up. Ramyeon, extra broth, and water, please. Thank you. The waiter stared at her. She had already turned back to her notes. Somewhere behind her, she heard a shift. A stillness, the particular kind of silence that spreads through a room not because it's quiet, but because the people in it have all decided simultaneously to stop moving, stop talking, stop drawing attention to themselves. The kind of silence that precedes something. Adaeze highlighted a sentence. The consolidation of criminal enterprise in Seoul's underground follows a feudal model of loyalty distribution. She heard the velvet rope clink. She heard footsteps on marble. Measured. Unhurried. The footsteps of someone who had never in his life been in a hurry because the world arranged itself around his schedule, not the other way around. She heard the armed men, and she knew they were armed because she studied these things, because the way men moved when they were carrying changed the cadence of their walk in ways that were almost imperceptible until you trained yourself to notice. Take positions around the elevated section like chess pieces settling onto a board. She did not look up. A chair pulled back across from her. Someone sat down. Adaeze finished highlighting her sentence, uncapped a second color, and reached for the next paragraph. You are sitting at my table. The voice was low, not loud, not threatening in the way people expected threats to sound. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to perform danger because it had long since become danger, the way a deep river doesn't roar. It just moves and things get swept away. Adaeze looked up for the first time. The man across from her was, and she would not give herself permission to think about this too hard later, unfairly constructed. Sharp jaw. Dark eyes that held the specific quality of someone who processed everything and revealed nothing. He was in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her entire semester's tuition, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not anger, not amusement, something hovering between the two, watching her the way you'd watch an unusual weather event. Surprised that it was happening, genuinely curious about what it would do next. 2 men stood behind him, 3 more near the rope. Adaeze looked at him, looked at the men, looked back at him. Then she looked at her notes, then back at him. If you're important, she said, you can share the table. If you're not, you can wait. Not a single person in that restaurant breathed. One of the men behind him actually put his hand on his jacket. The man at the table held up 2 fingers, barely. A gesture so small and so absolute that the hand dropped immediately. He looked at Adaeze across the white roses and the open criminology textbook and the spread of highlighted notes, and something moved across his face so quickly she almost missed it. He almost smiled. Shin Jaeho, he said, not introducing himself. Just saying the name the way you state a fact that should require no further elaboration. Adaeze Okafor, she said, turning a page. Graduate student. Criminology. And that ramyeon better arrive before I lose my mind. The waiter, who had been frozen 6 feet away in abject terror, suddenly remembered how to walk and disappeared toward the kitchen at a pace that was technically not running. Jaeho sat back in his chair. He picked up one of the menus, opened it and said nothing. Around them the restaurant exhaled slowly, cautiously, the way a room full of people exhales when they're not quite sure the emergency is over but they've decided to act like it is. Adaeze highlighted another line. Jaeho watched her over the top of the menu. The doors opened again. She arrived the way women arrived when they had prepared for arrival. Not just for the destination but for the journey from the car door to the table, for the exact angle of the lighting, for the gasp that preceded them. Kim Soyeon was in a white dress that moved like water, her hair pinned with a single gold piece. Her posture the product of 2 decades of being told that elegance was currency, and she had accumulated a fortune. She was beautiful in the kind of complete architectural way that made other beautiful women acknowledge the craftsmanship. Every eye in Jongsik turned toward her. Except one. Jaeho had not looked up from the menu. Soyeon reached the 2 steps, took in the scene. The man she'd been told was Seoul's most powerful and dangerous, with a foreign girl in a wet hoodie sitting across from him. Organized crime textbooks open on the table. And her smile remained perfectly in place through what Adaeze recognized as considerable professional effort. Jaeho SSI, she said warmly. He lowered the menu. Looked at her with the same measured quality he looked at everything, as though he was running a rapid assessment and the results were coming back neutral. You may leave, he said. The restaurant didn't gasp so much as collectively lose structural integrity. Soyeon's smile fractured. Just at the corners, just for a half second. Before she reassembled it with impressive speed. She looked at the foreign girl at the table. The foreign girl was highlighting a paragraph about lieutenant-level loyalty structures in transnational crime networks and appeared to be completely unaware that she was at the center of the most extraordinary social event Jongsik had witnessed in its 12-year history. Soyeon left. Adaeze finally looked up. She looked at the empty doorway. She looked at the assembled restaurant staff, all of whom were finding the middle distance intensely interesting. She looked at the armed men who had fanned out with the focused blankness of people who had been professionally trained to have no reactions. Then she looked at the man across from her. Wait, she said. Were you on a date? I was supposed to be. And you just... She pointed at the door. Yes. Because of me? Because I found better company. Adaeze stared at him for a long moment. Then she closed her highlighter, capped it, and set it carefully on top of her notes. That was extremely rude, she said. To her. Not to me. To her. You owe that woman an apology. Jaeho looked at her with something that had moved fully past amusement and was now residing in genuine fascination. You're lecturing me on etiquette. I'm lecturing you on basic human decency, which is different. She got dressed up. She came out in the rain. You sent her home because a wet foreign girl commandeered your table. She picked up the menu. That's bad behavior. And yet you're still at my table. Because I'm hungry. My bad behavior and your bad behavior are separate issues. The waiter arrived with the ramyeon, set it down with shaking hands, and retreated. Adaeze pulled the bowl toward her and reached for her chopsticks. Jaeho ordered in Korean without looking at the menu. They ate in silence for 11 minutes. It was the most interesting 11 minutes Shin Jaeho had experienced in 3 years. She found out who he was the next morning. Not because he told her. Because she typed Shin Jaeho Seoul into her laptop at 7 a.m., sitting cross-legged on her dormitory bed with her first cup of coffee going cold beside her. And the results came back fast and comprehensive and with the specific energy of a search engine trying to warn you about something. The articles were careful in the way Korean journalism was careful about certain subjects, full of suggestion and structural implication, stopping just short of the thing they were clearly saying. Business magnate. Alleged connections to organized crime syndicates. Untouchable. There were photographs. Him leaving a courthouse. Him at a charity gala. Him being escorted into a black vehicle while 3 different news cameras documented the moment from 3 different angles. None of them close enough to matter. There was one article from 4 years ago. A rival organization leader had been found. The article used the word discovered, which was doing a lot of work in the Han River. The investigation had gone nowhere. In the comments section of that article, someone had written a single line. Everyone knows who runs Seoul's underworld. Nobody says the name twice. Adaeze closed the laptop. She sat with her cold coffee for a long time. Then she opened the laptop again and typed, Criminology Dissertation Ethics Protocol for Accidental Personal Contact with Organized Crime Subjects. There were no results for that exact query. She was going to have to figure this one out herself. The problem was that he already knew where she was. She discovered this at 2 in the afternoon when she came out of Professor Kwan's seminar on criminal justice policy reform and found a black car idling at the curb outside the building, and a man in a suit who was clearly not a student leaning against it in the particular way that meant he was waiting for her specifically. He held out an envelope. She took it because refusing felt like the kind of choice that created more problems than it solved. Inside was a single card. Black. The name Shin Jaeho embossed in silver. On the back, in handwriting that was precise and unexpectedly elegant. You left your highlighter at my table. Also in the envelope was the highlighter. Adaeze turned it over in her hands. Looked at the car. Looked at the man. Tell him thank you, she said, and walked back toward the campus library. The man watched her go. He got in the car. He reported what she'd said with the air of someone relaying information that was going to be interesting to deliver. In the back of the car, 3 blocks away, Shin Jaeho heard the message and said nothing. But the edge of his mouth moved in a way that his driver, who had worked for him for 9 years, had never seen before and quietly filed as significant. She started noticing him the following week. Not immediately. Not all at once. It was incremental. A black car on the street outside the coffee shop she used on Tuesdays. A figure at a corner table in the bookstore near campus. Reading, gone by the time she looked twice. A moment outside the university gate where a group of men in suits passed and one of them, the one in the middle, slowed almost imperceptibly as she walked by, and she would have thought she imagined it except that 2 of the others adjusted their pace to match his and that kind of synchronized movement didn't happen by accident. She let it accumulate for 3 days. On the 4th day she was at her regular coffee shop, the small one run by an elderly couple near the campus east entrance, and she looked up from her laptop and he was sitting at the table by the window. Not pretending to be there coincidentally. Not performing casualness. Just sitting there with his own coffee and what appeared to be a document of some kind, reading, in the particular unhurried way he did everything. Adaeze saved her document, closed the laptop, picked up her coffee cup, and walked to his table. She sat down. You run half the underground in Seoul, she said. And you can't control your stalking. He looked up. The document in his hands was, she now saw, a property development prospectus. He set it down. I prefer to think of it as proximity management. That's not a thing. It is now. Shin Jaeho. She said his name carefully, with the deliberate weight of someone who had researched it and understood its dimensions. I'm a criminology graduate student. My entire academic career is built on studying people like you. You understanding who I am, that's fine. Me being seen with you repeatedly. That has implications for my work, my credibility, my visa status, and my physical safety. He was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this carefully. I think about everything carefully. That's my whole thing. And yet you sat at my table. That was before I knew your table came with armed guards and a body count attached to your Wikipedia page. She looked at him steadily. I'm asking you to stop following me. He picked up his coffee. Considered it. What if I made it worth your while to be followed? That's the most crime boss thing you've ever said to me. I've known you for a week. You've been following me for a week. That's different from knowing me. She stood up. Stop appearing near me. Please. She walked back to her table. He watched her go. He did not stop appearing near her. But he changed his approach. The cars became less obvious. The men in suits stopped synchronizing. And he himself started appearing not as surveillance but as presence. In the places she already was, with enough plausible distance that she couldn't technically call it following. The coffee shop. The bookstore. Once, memorably, the campus library, where he sat reading a biography of Lee Kuan-hee. 3 rows from her study corral for 2 hours before she finally wrote on a sticky note and slid it down the row. This is a library. Why are you here? The sticky note came back. Reading. Also dinner. She wrote. No. He wrote. You haven't eaten since this morning. I had my people check. She wrote with considerable force. That is extremely alarming and I have so many follow-up concerns about that sentence. He wrote. The ramyeon place near Eastgate. Not a date. Just food. You bring your notes if it makes you feel better. She looked at the sticky note for a long time. She wrote. You're paying. She brought her notes. They argued for 90 minutes over pork belly and soju she didn't drink and he mostly ignored, and the argument was about whether predictive behavioral profiling had ethical applications in crime prevention or whether it was surveillance infrastructure dressed up in academic language, and he took the position she didn't expect, that it was both simultaneously, and that the distinction between tool and weapon was always about the hands holding it, not the object itself. She put her chopsticks down halfway through this point and looked at him. That's not a crime boss argument, she said. That's a philosophy argument. Crime bosses read philosophy. Do they? The good ones do. He refilled her water glass. You study us. What do your textbooks say about us? They say you're rational actors operating within alternative economic structures. They say organizational loyalty mirrors corporate structure. They say, she stopped. What? She looked at him. They say the ones who last are the ones who understand systems. Not just how to break them, how they function. And you clearly understand systems. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. He smiled. Not the half movement she'd seen before. An actual smile, brief and unguarded. There and gone before he seemed to realize he'd allowed it. She watched it happen and filed it in the part of her brain that noticed things and didn't know yet what to do with them. You're the first person in 4 years, he said, who has talked to me like I'm a person. The restaurant sounds filled the space between them. I'm talking to you like a case study, she said. I know, he said. It's the closest thing I've had. She didn't have a response to that didn't feel dangerous. So she picked up her chopsticks and ate, and he watched her eat with an expression she was becoming increasingly unable to categorize and increasingly unwilling to examine. The betrayal came to her in the form of patterns. She wasn't supposed to be involved. She'd made this clear. She had a dissertation to write, a visa to maintain, a future to build in which Shin Jaeho was a footnote. An extraordinary personal anecdote she would never put in writing and never tell her mother about, ever, not once, not under any circumstances, not while Adaeze Okafor was alive. But he'd been distracted for 3 days. Not visibly, not to most people. But she'd been paying attention for long enough now that she caught the frequency of it. The moments where his eyes went to his phone and his jaw tightened slightly. The way his men around him had become more watchful than usual, doing that particular recalibration that security details did when they'd been given new threat assessments. The fact that he'd canceled their standing Tuesday coffee twice in a row without adequate explanation. She told herself she didn't care about the canceled coffees. This was a lie she told herself poorly. On the 3rd day she texted him. You have a leak in your organization. Mid-level. Someone with access to your scheduling and movement logistics but not your inner circle. They've been active for approximately 6 weeks. The behavior change in your outer circle started about 3 weeks ago, which means your inner circle identified the problem but didn't tell you they identified it, which means they're managing information around you, which is its own problem. 3 minutes passed. His response. How do you know this? She wrote back, because I've been watching your people watch each other for 2 weeks and the geometry of it changed. Also your Tuesday cancel pattern, and your phone behavior on Monday between 11 and 2. A pause. Then, I study organized crime structures. This is what I do. He called her. She answered. Come to my office, he said. Absolutely not. Adaeze. Shin Jaeho. I am a criminology student on a student visa in a foreign country. I am not coming to your office to consult on your internal security situation. That is not my life. A pause. The restaurant on Dosendero. The private room. That's different from your office? Significantly. Define significantly. No criminal infrastructure. Clean space. Just a room. She was quiet for a moment. Bring your full scheduling logs for the last 8 weeks, she said. Personnel movement records. Whatever passes for an org chart in your world. And I want the timeline of every deviation from standard operation over the last 2 months. You know what those documents contain. I know. And you're going to trust me with them anyway, because you need what I can see and your own people can't see it because they're inside it. She paused. I trust you not to use this against me. You trust me with the information. That's the deal. Another pause. Longer this time. Yes, he said. She arrived at the private room of the Dosendero restaurant at 8 p.m. with a legal pad, 3 different colored pens, and the particular focused energy of someone who was about to do the most interesting thing she'd ever done, and was absolutely not allowed to admit that. He was already there. The documents were spread across the table, not digital, printed, which meant he understood the security implications of digital footprints, which she noted. He'd brought 2 men into the room with him, which she noted also. They leave, she said. He looked at her. I'm not analyzing anything in front of people who are part of the system I'm analyzing, she said. Basic research protocol. They leave. He dismissed them. She sat down, pulled the documents toward her and started reading. She didn't speak for 40 minutes. He watched her work. He watched her cross-reference scheduling logs against personnel movement records. He watched her build a timeline on the legal pad with the colored pens, blue for standard movement, red for deviation, green for correspondence between internal scheduling and what turned out to be, as she built the map, 3 separate instances where external actors had information they could only have received from inside. Kim Sungji, she said. He went still. 3rd tier. He's had access to your personal movement schedule since March. He's smart, the deviations are small, infrequent, designed to look like coincidence if you're checking individually. But they're not coincidence. She turned the legal pad toward him. These 3 events, she circled them in red, all had external correlates within 24 hours. Same source. And his behavioral pattern, she pointed to the movement records, has a tell. He overreports when he's compensating. Look at the detail level in his weekly submissions versus the others. Jaeho looked at the legal pad. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. Sungji has been with me for 7 years, he said. I know. That's why nobody caught it. Longevity creates blind spots. Your inner circle couldn't see it because his loyalty history is part of how they read him. I don't have that history. I see the pattern without the relationship attached to it. She capped her pen. Don't move on him yet. There's a second person, I think, who's been facilitating the handoff, but I only have circumstantial geometry on that. I need another week of movement data. Jaeho was looking at her with an expression she had no prior reference point for. Something had moved in him. She could see it without being able to name it, the way pressure moves behind a sealed wall. How do you do that? He said. Do what? See it. So clearly. So quickly. She looked at him for a moment. Because I've spent my whole life learning to see things people don't want me to see, she said. Because I'm black and foreign in a city that decided what I was before I opened my mouth. And surviving that teaches you to read rooms. Read people. Read the gap between what's presented and what's true. You learn it or you get crushed. She gathered the legal pad. I'll look at the second set of data when you have it. He reached across the table and put his hand briefly, very briefly, on her wrist. Thank you, he said. She looked at his hand. He removed it. Don't thank me, she said. Pay for the dinner. The second week of the data analysis brought her back to the private room 3 times. By the third visit they'd fallen into a rhythm. She arrived, he had documents ready. She worked. He watched and occasionally asked questions that she answered with the patient precision of a teacher who genuinely liked explaining things. She began to notice that he was paying the kind of attention to her explanations that most people didn't. Not just waiting for the conclusion but actually following the methodology, asking about the reasoning rather than just the result. You would have been good at this, she said once. Not organized crime. She meant analysis. Systematic thinking. He understood what she meant. I was never given the choice, he said. She looked up from the document. My father ran this organization before me, he said. Not explaining. Not seeking sympathy. Just stating it the way you state geography. I was groomed for it from the time I was old enough to understand what grooming was. By the time I was 17 I had already done things I couldn't undo. By the time I was 20 the shape of my life was set and the door back was closed. She set her pen down. Did you ever want something different? A long pause. I wanted to study architecture, he said. When I was 12. I used to draw buildings. The corner of his mouth moved. My father thought it was a waste of time. Shin Jaeho. She said his name with a weight that wasn't pity. He would have deflected pity immediately, but something more like recognition. You drew buildings. Very bad ones. But you drew them. He looked at her. Why does that matter to you? Because it means you were someone before this. And you still are. She picked up her pen again. People who were only ever this don't notice when someone overreports on their weekly submissions. He was quiet for a moment. You were underestimated, he said. Not a question. He'd been listening. Every day, she said. Since I landed. My Korean is functional enough for daily life and somewhere between a C and a B in academic settings. And every time I walk into a room in this country there's a half second where the room decides who it thinks I am before I say a word. Too dark. Too foreign. Dressed wrong. Braids instead of straight hair. Sneakers instead of heels. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the documents. I got a scholarship to come here. Top of my program at Lagos State. My advisor called me exceptional. And I still have to fight for the basic assumption of competence every single day in this city. And yet you stayed. Because I'm more stubborn than the discomfort, she said. And because the research is genuinely good. Korean organized crime structures are some of the most sophisticated in the world. Which is awkward given my current situation. He almost laughed. It was closer than it had ever been. She finally looked at him. He was closer than she'd registered. The way he sometimes moved without her noticing. Not sneaky, just quiet. The trained stillness of a man who had spent years moving through rooms without announcing himself. The amber light was doing something particular to his face. He reached out and brushed a braid from her cheek. It had escaped from under the cap, curling forward. The gesture was slow, deliberate. He didn't pretend it was anything other than what it was. She went very still. I'm not your type, she said. Low, almost a reflex. You are, he said. Exactly my type. You don't know my type. No. I said you are mine. His voice was steady. His hand had dropped back to the table. I have been in rooms with powerful women, beautiful women, women who understood this world and could move in it. Not one of them has ever made me want to explain myself. He paused. You make me want to explain myself. That's a symptom, she said. Not a compliment. It's both. The silence lasted a moment too long to be casual. She picked up her pen. The second person, she said, is almost certainly someone with overlapping access to both Sungji's reports and your travel calendar. That narrows it to 4 people. I'll have a name by tomorrow. Adaeze. She looked up. I know what you're doing, he said. I'm profiling your security leak. Yes, he said. And? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the documents. And I'm also sitting at the right distance from something I should probably be further away from, she said quietly. So I'm going to finish the work. He let her. But the amber light stayed the way it was, and neither of them suggested it was getting late. She had the second name by 8 the following morning. By 8:30 she'd sent it via text. By 9 he'd confirmed it with resources she didn't ask about and didn't want to know. By 9:45 she received a message, both addressed. Organization is clean. Thank you. She was sitting in Professor Kwan's methodology seminar looking at the message and feeling the specific vertigo of someone who has just helped dismantle a criminal conspiracy from inside a university lecture hall. She was also, she acknowledged to herself, more unsettled by last night's almost moment than by any of it. She texted back. Glad it's resolved. I'm going back to my dissertation. He texted, dinner. She texted, Jaeho. He texted, not asking. Informing. She stared at this for a long moment. She put her phone face down on the desk and tried to pay attention to Professor Kwan's discussion of cross-jurisdictional law enforcement cooperation and found that she could not quite manage it. She texted, fine. But I picked the place. She picked a small Jajangmyeon restaurant near campus that cost 12,001 per person and had plastic chairs and laminated menus and the best noodles in Gangnam. And she felt a specific satisfaction in watching Shin Jaeho, who she suspected had never eaten at a table without a white tablecloth in his adult life, sit across from her in a plastic chair eating black bean noodles with genuine and apparently unironic enjoyment. This is good, he said. I know, she said. Also, it costs less than the flower arrangement at Jongsik. Is this a statement? This is me showing you that good things exist at all price points, and that where you sit doesn't determine the quality of what you receive. She twirled her noodles. I'm a graduate student. This is my world. You can either fit into it or you can eat alone at your expensive table. He looked at her. I spent 3 weeks appearing near you in various locations. I know. I haven't done that for anyone. I know that too. And you're still lecturing me about plastic chairs. Yes, because that's who I am. If you can't handle the plastic chairs, you absolutely cannot handle me. He picked up his noodles. He ate, he said without looking up. I can handle the plastic chairs. She let herself smile just slightly, because he wasn't looking. He was, though. The threat arrived on a Thursday. She found out about it the way she found out about most things, in the gap between what was said and what was true. She'd been walking back from the library at 9:30 p.m. when 2 men fell into step behind her, and she knew before she knew consciously that something was wrong because they matched her pace in the too deliberate way that people did when they were trying to appear casual and weren't particularly good at it. And when she turned abruptly at the corner, they didn't turn naturally, they adjusted, and that adjustment was the tell. She pulled out her phone. She got 3 words into a text to Jaeho before the car pulled up. She never finished the text. She came back to herself in a room. Concrete walls. One window, high and small, admitting a gray pre-dawn light that gave her nothing useful about location. She was sitting on a metal chair. Her hands weren't bound, which was interesting. Either they were confident she couldn't leave or they wanted her to remain calm. And both interpretations were informative. She was not calm. She was performing calm the way she'd learned to perform it, channeling everything that wanted to be fear into the part of her brain that processed information, letting it run like an engine rather than a fire. She had been taken because of him. She was sure of that. Not for money, she didn't have any. Not for information she'd given him. She hadn't given him anything that his enemies could use. She was leverage. She was the thing that mattered to the one person in Seoul whose cooperation a rival organization needed. She filed this under, he is going to destroy something significant when he finds out where I am. She filed this under, he is going to find out where I am. She waited. She counted her heartbeats and did the breathing exercise her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old, the one Adaeze Okafor used during power outages in Lagos and during the harder seasons and during every other time the world had decided to be unreasonable. She waited, and she breathed, and she was not broken. What happened in the city that night was documented in police reports that were subsequently sealed, in insurance claims filed for property damage across 6 locations in Gangnam and Mapo, in 3 hospital admissions that listed their cause as altercation, and in a series of wire transfers that moved money in ways that made certain business partnerships very rapidly untenable. None of the documentation captured the shape of it correctly. What actually happened was that Shin Jaeho received the incomplete text at 9:31 p.m. and did not panic. He had, in his life, made many decisions out of anger and several out of desperation and a significant number out of cold calculation. He made this one out of something that had no name in the organizational playbook, something that moved through him like a current the moment he understood what the incomplete text meant, something that cleared his thinking down to a bright, absolute point. He called his most trusted lieutenant. He said 4 words. Find her. Everything else stops. He spent the next 6 hours dismantling, with surgical precision, 3 separate operational alliances that connected to the rival organization he identified as responsible. He called in 7 years of accumulated debts and favors. He moved through Seoul's underworld infrastructure with the methodical focus of someone who understood it better than anyone alive and was prepared to use every piece of that understanding simultaneously. He found her at 3:47 a.m. The location was a warehouse in Mapo, held by 4 men who, by the time Jaeho's people arrived, had received enough information from their own network about what was currently happening to their organization's financial infrastructure to be, collectively, a great deal less confident than they had been 6 hours earlier. Jaeho walked in himself. He had not sent anyone ahead. He had not waited outside. She was sitting on the metal chair. She looked up when he came through the door, and for a moment, one single unguarded moment, something moved across her face that she immediately replaced with composure. But he had seen it. He had seen what it cost her to be composed. And it cost him something in return that he didn't have a name for either. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. She stood. She was a full head shorter than him. She tilted her face up. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No. Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She held his gaze. Her voice was steady. "You escalated a city war for me." "Yes. You just dismantled operational infrastructure across multiple organizations in one night." "Yes." She looked at him for a long, still moment. "I would end nations for you," he said very quietly. She breathed, in and out, the practiced breath, the engine not fire. "I know," she said. "That's the problem." She was gone by the end of the week. Not from Seoul. From him. From the orbit they'd been sustaining. The plastic chairs and the amber light and the organized crime documents spread across private restaurant tables. She texted to say she was fine. She texted to say she needed distance. She did not text to say she was sitting in her dormitory room at 11 p.m. thinking about him, which was the most honest thing she could have texted and also the one thing she absolutely could not send. Because she understood, with the analytical clarity she'd spent 5 years building, what she'd seen in that warehouse. She'd seen a man who had burned something significant to get to her. Not because she'd asked him to. Not because she'd been in danger before and handled it alone. But because of what she'd become to him. And what she'd become to him was someone whose disappearance had removed something he didn't know he had. That was the problem. She was not afraid of him. She'd never been afraid of him. She was afraid of being the reason the violence continued. She was afraid of being the leverage that someone would always reach for. She was afraid of the version of the story where she stayed in his world and her scholarship, her visa, her dissertation, her carefully constructed future. All of it became secondary to the life he moved through, the decisions she couldn't control, the enemies she'd never see coming. She wrote 11 different messages over 3 days. She sent none of them. He sent one. It arrived on a Sunday evening. Not a text. A letter. Handwritten. Delivered by the man who always waited outside and left it at the dormitory reception with her name on the envelope in that precise, unexpectedly elegant handwriting. She opened it at her desk. It was long. It was the most words she'd ever seen him commit to in one place. He wrote about the architecture drawings he'd made at 12. He wrote about the specific way his father had explained the shape of his life to him at 15. Not cruelly, almost practically, the way you explain weather, and how he'd understood even then that understanding wasn't the same as consent. He wrote about the 8 years between 17 and 25 that he couldn't give back and the things he'd built in their absence that were real and were his and were also wrong. He wrote, "You told me I was someone before this. You are the first person who wanted to know who that was." He wrote, "I don't know how to ask you to trust me with the future yet. I know I have to earn that. I'm telling you I understand what has to change, and I'm telling you I've started changing it." At the bottom, the wrong table was the right table. "I think you know that." She put the letter down. She picked it up again. She held it for a very long time. She did not go back to him immediately. That wasn't the kind of woman she was. She didn't run toward things just because they pulled. She sat with the letter for 2 weeks. She talked to nobody about it because there was nobody who would have understood the geometry of it. She went to class. She worked on chapter 3 of her dissertation, which was, with a painful irony she could only appreciate in retrospect, about rehabilitation frameworks for organized crime participants in South Korean legal contexts. She thought about the thin scar on his right hand that he told her once was from a kitchen accident when he was 7, and that she'd never asked more about, because she understood it wasn't from a kitchen accident. She thought about the architecture drawings. She thought about the way he'd said, "I would end nations for you," not as a boast, not as a declaration of territorial possession, but as the bare truth of what she had become to him. Not romantic in the fairy tale sense. In the actual sense. In the sense that two people who had spent their lives being unseen had found each other in a VIP section in the rain, and something had been set in motion that neither of them had chosen and neither of them could entirely choose against. She texted him, "How is the restructuring going?" He texted back, 30 seconds later. Slow. Complicated. Necessary. She texted, "Good answers." He texted, "Dinner." She smiled at her phone. She put it face down. She picked it up. She texted, "Plastic chairs." He texted, "Obviously." It didn't happen in a single moment. That was the thing about real things, they didn't arrive with cinematic clarity, with a single scene where the music swelled and the rain fell at the perfect angle. It happened over months. It happened in the spaces between his restructuring and her dissertating, in the Jajangmyeon place and 3 other plastic chair establishments she identified as meeting her standards. It happened in long conversations about legal business architecture that required the same understanding of organizational systems as a legal business architecture, and about the gap between what law could accomplish and what it couldn't, and about power and who held it and whether holding it could ever be done cleanly. It happened in the moment she met his most senior remaining lieutenant, a quiet man named Oh Dong-soo who had apparently decided within 3 minutes of meeting her that she was the most interesting thing that had happened to his employer in a decade, and realized without entirely deciding to that she had started thinking about his organization as something she was adjacent to rather than something she was avoiding. It happened when she defended her dissertation. She stood before 5 professors in a conference room and presented 18 months of research on organized crime structures in Seoul with a depth of access that her advisor called unprecedented and a methodology that she described as innovative and that she privately knew was possible because she had done the most unusual field research in the history of Korean criminology. She graduated top of her class on a bright March morning, dressed in academic robes over her hoodie because she was not giving up the hoodie for anyone, and she scanned the audience and found him in the back. He had come without the men. He was in a dark suit and he looked, from this distance, like anyone, just a man watching someone he cared about accomplish something. She looked at him for one moment across the rows of graduating students and their proud families. She looked forward again and she held her diploma with both hands, and she was no longer Adaeze Okafor, foreign student on a visa, too dark, too foreign, dressed wrong, half invisible in the rooms that decided who she was before she spoke. She was exactly who she'd always been, in exactly the place she'd worked to reach, and the room knew it now whether it wanted to or not. If this story is hitting different right now, if you're somewhere between "this is impossible" and "this is exactly what I needed," subscribe. Drop a comment. Tell me what you're feeling. We're going on this journey together and I need to know you're here. The Shadow Queen. She didn't choose the name. Nobody chose names like that. They arrived the way reputation arrived, in pieces accumulated through instances that each seemed small until they weren't. The first instance was a meeting with a hotel development group that was attempting to negotiate with one of Jaeho's now legitimized real estate holdings, and had arrived with the assumption that they were negotiating with a man who had recently exited criminal enterprise and therefore might have gaps in his understanding of contract architecture. Adaeze sat beside Jaeho in that meeting and said nothing for 45 minutes while the development group's lead representative laid out terms that were, technically, legal and structurally, extractive in 3 specific ways that the representative believed were too subtle to be caught in a first read. When the representative finished, she opened her copy of the contract and said, "Clause 14, subsection C. You've inserted a performance penalty structure that triggers under conditions your company controls. Clause 22, the force majeure definition is written to include market downturns, which is not standard force majeure language and which effectively removes your obligations during the conditions most likely to affect both parties. And Clause 31 contains an arbitration jurisdiction clause that would require any dispute to be handled in a jurisdiction where your company's retained legal team has significantly more experience." She closed the contract. "You can revise and resubmit or we can find another development partner. We have 3. The representative looked at the woman across the table from him in the dark blazer and the braids, not tucked under a cap this time, loose, deliberate, and revised his understanding of the meeting considerably. The revised contract arrived within 48 hours. Word moved the way word moved in certain circles. The woman beside Shin Jaeho, the strategic mind, the one who didn't raise her voice, the one you didn't underestimate twice, the Shadow Queen. She heard it for the first time from Oh Dong-soo, who mentioned it with the air of someone presenting an interesting data point and not expressing a personal opinion. She looked at Jaeho. He looked back at her with the specific neutrality of someone who had already had feelings about this and decided to let her have her own. "I don't love it," she said. "It's accurate," said Oh Dong-soo. "It sounds like a title." "It is a title." She thought about it. She'd spent years being invisible, being the one who didn't register, being the background of other people's narratives. She thought about the 12-year-old who'd drawn bad buildings, about the criminology student in the wet hoodie who'd sat down at the wrong table, about the two of them in amber light over organized crime documents. Fine, she said. But I'm keeping the hoodie. Oh Dong-soo considered this. The hoodie actually adds to it. She kept the hoodie. She was 29 when she found out she was pregnant. She sat in the bathroom of the Gangnam penthouse. Their penthouse, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that had spent 5 years becoming hers in all the ways that mattered, and held the test in her hands and breathed. In and out. The engine not fire. She felt, in the quiet of it, something she hadn't fully expected. Certainty. Not the forced certainty of someone talking themselves into a feeling, but the deep, unargued certainty of a thing that was simply true. She thought about her mother in Lagos, who had called her stubborn since she was 4 and said it like a compliment. She thought about being 7 years old and learning the breathing exercise. She thought about a VIP section in Gangnam and rain on the windows and a man who had looked at her homework and chosen her over the beauty, and about everything that had happened in the 5 years since, the dismantling and rebuilding, the dissertation and the development meetings, the plastic chairs and the penthouse, the work that was theirs together and the self that was still completely hers. She went to find him. He was in the main room, standing at the windows, looking out at the city the way he sometimes did in the evenings, with the quiet of someone who had made a long and costly peace with the view. She walked to him. She stood beside him. She held up the test. He was very still for a moment. He turned to look at her. He looked at the test. He looked at her face. He went to his knees. She hadn't expected that. She looked down at him and felt something move in her chest. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a gesture that had no calculation in it. Nothing performed, nothing strategic. Just a man going to his knees because the weight of the moment exceeded the capacity to stand casually. You sat at the wrong table, he said. His voice was barely there. She felt the smile come, slow and complete, the kind that started somewhere deep and arrived on the face like weather. No, she said softly. I sat at the right one. He put his hands gently on either side of her. Not reaching for her hand, not grasping for the test, just placing his hands with a care that she recognized as the architecture drawings made real, as the 12-year-old who'd wanted to build things, finally building something that mattered and knowing it. He pressed his forehead to her. Outside, Seoul spread itself across the dark in 100,000 lights. Adaeze Okafor, who had come to the city in a wet hoodie with braids under a cap and annotated crime textbooks in her backpack, who had sat at the wrong table and refused to move and refused to shrink and refused to become less than everything she was, held the beginning of her family in her hands and breathed. In and out. The engine. Not the fire. Both actually. Both. If you made it to the end of this story, you're exactly the person this channel exists for. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Drop a comment and tell me, team, she sat at the right table? Or did you see this ending coming? Like this video if you want more stories that hit this deep. We're just getting started.